Hi, everyone. My name is Amber Lynn, and I am the student director of the inaugural Princeton Energy Conference. Thank you again for coming out. I am honored to introduce our final keynote for Commissioner Cheryl LaFleur, class of 1975. I will read her biography shortly, and I just want to share that really this conference started when one of our board members, Jason Mulderig, who is doing the videotaping right now, when he reached out to Commissioner LaFleur asking if she would be interested in an alumni interview. And not only did she respond with a very detailed and insightful response that we have on our website for everyone to read, but she offered to come to Princeton for a talk in the spring. And that's really where the whole conference idea came about. So it's really an honor to have her here. Quickly reviewing her longer biography, we have a shortened version printed in the program. Commissioner Cheryl LaFleur was first nominated by President Barack Obama to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in 2010 and was confirmed for a second term by the Senate in 2014. She served as acting chairman of the commission from November 2013 to July 2014 and January to August 2017, and as chairman from July 2014 until April 2015. Cheryl LaFleur is honored to be a member of the Commission at a time when the nation is making substantial changes in its energy supply and infrastructure to meet environmental challenges and improve reliability and security. Since she joined the Commission, her priorities have included reliability and grid security, supporting the development and evolution of robust, competitive markets, promoting regional transmission planning, and supporting a clean and diverse power supply. She is a member of the NARUC Committee on Electricity and Critical Infrastructure and was co-chair of the FERC NARUC Forum on Reliability and the Environment. She is a frequent speaker on energy issues. Prior to joining the Commission in 2010, Commissioner LaFleur had more than 20 years of experience as a leader in the electric and natural gas industry. She served as Executive Vice President and Acting CEO of National Grid USA, responsible for the delivery of electricity to 3.4 million customers in the Northeast. Her previous positions at National Grid USA and its predecessor, New England Electric System, including Chief Operating Officer, President of the New England Distribution Companies, and General Counsel. She led major efforts to improve reliability and employee safety. Earlier in her career, she was responsible for leading award-winning conservation and demand response programs for customers. Commissioner LaFleur has been a nonprofit board member and leader and is also active in a number of women's energy organizations. She was named Women of the Year by the Women's Council on Energy and the Environment in 2015. In 2014, the Northeast Energy and Commerce Association presented her with its Vanguard Award for her longtime leadership in the development of competitive power markets. She received a bipartisan congressional award in 2013 for her work on grid reliability. Finally, Commissioner LaFleur began her career as an attorney at Ropes & Gray in Boston. She has a JD from Harvard Law School, where she was editor of the Harvard Law Review, and an AB from Princeton University. A native of Massachusetts, she is married to William Kunzik, a retired attorney, and they are the parents of 2 grown children. So welcome to the stage, Cheryl LaFleur.
Well, thank you so much, Amber. Sorry my biography is so long. I should add a line, and the grandparents of 1 little granddaughter. So, well, I'm really happy to be here. There you are. It's always a real honor and a pleasure to be at Princeton, and it was kind of a gulping moment when I walked into Mader Hall. Paul Mader was a classmate of my husband and myself. He obviously made something of himself, and I'm glad he's... And I also want to thank Judy Greenwald for organizing this New Jersey Energy Day. Want to introduce Chris Fitzpatrick, who's in the second row, who is an advisor in my office at FERC. That's the way the offices are set up, like law clerks. They do all the work. And also shout out to my husband, who was just mentioned, who in addition to his own career, little known factoid, was an intern on the very first New Jersey Energy Plan in 1974. So it's kind of interesting to be here on the day after the New Jersey legislature passed the energy legislation that Ralph Izzo spoke about earlier. And And it's exciting to see the developments in energy efficiency and solar and other clean energy. I'm also excited that New Jersey is considering rejoining RGGI. It was a real loss for RGGI. This is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a multi-state collaborative of groups that put a value on greenhouse gases. Exciting that a state as important as New Jersey is rejoining. We've talked a lot today about state energy policy. I'm going to give a bit of a federal perspective. Before I start, I speak only for myself, not for the commission. We've had a lot of dissents and concurrences lately, so I think that's fairly obvious we're not all a monolith. And I will not discuss pending adjudicated cases, but I'll take questions on anything else. Want to give just a little bit of an introduction to FERC, because I know we're not a household word for everyone. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is an independent agency. We're affiliated with, but not part of, the Department of Energy. And like all the independent agencies, the SEC, the FCC, and so forth, we're made up of 5 commissioners. I sometimes say we're not like the Beatles. We didn't grow up playing music together. We're like the Monkees. We're all chosen separately and said, go be a commission. We're each independent presidential appointees confirmed by the Senate, and we're bipartisan by statutory requirement. No more than 3 can be of any one party, generally 3 of the president's party and 2 of the opposing party. And it took a little bit of time for us to get staffed up in the Trump administration, but that is where we are now. We have 3 Republicans who were chosen by President Trump, 1 other Democrat who joined the commission in December, and I am the Obama holdover, still there. We are an independent agency, meaning we can be, removed if we steal from the till or something, but you can't be removed for policy reasons. You have a term, and so that we're independent by design, which I think is more and more important in government. And we're responsible for interstate and wholesale energy markets and infrastructure. So the regional markets that we heard a little bit about in the panel this morning, I actually wasn't here for that because of the fact that I can't talk about pending cases, but I know you heard about that, as well as interstate transmission, interstate pipelines, hydro on the nation's rivers, cybersecurity and reliability, and a few other things. We are part of a very complex ecosystem that regulates energy and the environment in this country. Even within the federal branch, we have us, the DOE, the EPA, the Nuclear Commission, and so forth. And of course, in 50 state capitals, we have corresponding commissions and others who make policy in the states, as here in New Jersey. It's kind of a cliche for any speaker to say we're at a time of great change, but actually I believe we are at a time of great change. We're going through quite a transformation in the way our nation produces and utilizes energy. And that's really driven, that's not being shaped by FERC. We're not that powerful, but it's driving and shaping a lot of our work, both on energy markets and on energy infrastructure. And it's really driven by 3 macro factors. The first, which we heard some about this morning, is the increased availability and affordability of domestic natural gas. I am old enough to remember when we were running out of gas. We would have no more by 1990, and it was illegal to burn gas in a power plant because it was in such short supply. Well, now with the new extraction and production methods, particularly the horizontal drilling in conjunction with hydraulic fracturing, which always existed, but the horizontal drilling into shale has led to many multiple times of domestic natural gas that was thought to be extractable, and it seems to be growing all the time as they develop more methods. And so as a result of that, natural gas prices are a quarter of what they were 10 years ago, and on the futures markets are expected to be low out until 2027. And probably beyond, but that's as far as my statistics go. As a result of that, gas has become one of the dominant fuel for new electric generation. With new technologies, the new combined cycle and some of the new peaking units, it's one of the cheapest types of plants to build, and because the cost is mostly driven by the fuel with the sustained low cost of natural gas, has made gas quickly the dominant fuel in the parts of the country that use a market to price and dispatch electricity, making it more difficult, particularly for some of the other baseload technologies, coal and nuclear, to compete in those markets. That's true in New Jersey. In 2016, gas for the first time became a majority part of the generation fleet. The second big driver is the proliferation of new technologies. I agree with what Ralph said that, we haven't changed as much as telecom and whatever, but that is definitely changing. We see a profusion of new technologies, renewable energy, both central station and distributed solar, wind technology, energy storage, battery and other types, and computer-driven technologies. You can see how old I am. No one young ever says the word computer. Digital technologies that you deploy behind the meter to help people use electricity at different times of the day and more efficiently. Those technologies have different cost patterns. In general, all the money's up front, and then there's no fuel costs. So whereas we took it for granted that electricity was a volumetric product, you priced on the fuel. If the money's all up front and then there's zero marginal cost, that's a whole different cost curve. They have, in some cases, different geography, because you just can't build them where like, hey, here's my city, I'll build a power plant an hour away, build a wire, I'm done. No, they have to go where the solar or the wind is better, particularly the central station. And they have different operating characteristics because, for the most part, they are dependent on the wind or the sun or the technology. Storage could surely change that as it attains scale. And that is further helping gas generation because gas generation plays very well with renewables. It can ramp up quickly when the sun sets or the wind stops blowing. The third big driver of change is our increased understanding of the environmental consequences of energy, particularly climate. And this is where a lot of the interesting policy issues are falling out. Environmental has always been an issue in energy since at least the 1970s, but climate is really a dominant issue now that's shaping a lot of energy initiatives at the local, state, and formerly federal level. So a lot of our action right now is really trying to balance energy economics with environmental and climate policy. And this is the dominant challenge for anyone working in our field now, and I dare say for some time in the future, this will be the defining challenge. Optimal choice A would be to have a national climate policy, as many countries do, either a carbon goal, a carbon tax, a cap and trade, an objective, so that we could look at individual market choices or individual infrastructure permitting decisions within the context of a larger goal. We do not have that, as you know. President Obama tried hard to get cap and trade legislation passed unsuccessfully. People like Judy worked very hard to get a lot done within the existing legislative framework we had. One of the things that I've heard a lot for the last 8 years since I've been in the federal government, kind of used to get on my nerves, is people say, if only we had a federal energy policy. Things would be so much better if we had a coordinated federal energy policy. And by the way, some countries do, like Canada, which is an extractive country, seems to be able to have a carbon goal. If only we had a federal energy policy, things would be good. Well, guess what? We have a federal energy policy. That policy is to roll back Obama-era environmental laws, reassert coal dominance, put the coal miners back to work, extract and export as much fuel as the country has, and that policy is being driven from the White House and the Department of Energy right now. So what has happened is that the states, some of the regions, and even localities are doubling down on their efforts to address climate issues at their level. So what could go wrong? We're fixing a problem that starts with the word global, sometimes with a city solution. What could possibly go wrong? Well, what's wrong is that the way energy works, it's dispatched and deployed and planned over big multi-state regions, and now we have different states making different choices, and we're just trying to muddle through that political reality right now. That's the landscape FERC is dealing in, and we're trying to make it work. So the two big issues, I'm going to frame this kind of energy and the environment in two basic areas. One is the selection of resources in the market, and the second is infrastructure and pipelines. So starting with the markets, I already said that, well, so just by way of background, about 2/3 of the country, actually a little more right now, is served in competitive wholesale markets of some kind. In some parts of the country, they mostly started about 20 years ago, although they're still growing in the West. And in some parts of the country, including New Jersey, New England, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Texas, they also in the 1990s deregulated at the state level, went to a merchant generation model, and were using these regional entities successfully for to keep the lights on, to decide what resources we needed for reliability and for resource adequacy. When gas and renewables came roiling in, depressing market prices and which is good news for customers as long as the lights stay on, that was forcing some difficult decisions in those markets. So last fall, I think it was in September, I've kind of blanked it out, Secretary of Energy Rick Perry used a little-known provision of the Federal Power Act to, in essence, order FERC to consider and issue a regulation that would pay all baseload coal and nuclear full cost of service, not market prices, while letting the markets run around them. And it was premised on the belief that unless all those plants were allowed to stay open, and particularly close to the coal industry was very involved in the proposal, then the lights might go out because gas was too unreliable, it wasn't resilient enough. It's a little bit of an understatement to say that sent the energy world into a tizzy. FERC is rarely on the front page of the New York Times, but all of a sudden we were in the hot seat trying to figure this out. And I'm really happy to say that in January, the 5 of us, Republican and Democrat, unanimously decided not to issue that rule because we didn't believe it had been made out either that there was the resilience issue, and particularly not that if there was an issue, paying dozens or hundreds of plans full cost of service was the way to address that issue. And instead, we opened a more normal docket to look at resilience, and we're taking comments in that right now, and we'll see if things have to come out of that. For example, there are some issues with pipeline infrastructure in New England. There are various issues in different places. So we knew that wasn't the end of the story, and it wasn't the end of the story. A few weeks ago, First Energy, a company in Ohio with a primarily coal fleet, asked Secretary Perry to use emergency authority like we use if there's a specific power plant it's been used 5 or 6 times over the last 30 years for specific power plants that if they go out too soon while they're waiting for something else to be done, the lights may go out. Use that emergency authority to order all the coal and nuclear plants to stay on. And that is pending right now. The president has spoken favorably of the proposal. Secretary Perry testified yesterday saying that he's giving it very serious consideration, and there are other ways to skin that cat. He's looking at, this is essential, this has to happen, he's going to figure it out. So we're staying tuned to that situation. Of course, Secretary Perry isn't the only one who's unhappy with market outcomes. We're increasingly seeing states, including states that are in regions that have regional resource adequacy constructs, interested in picking which resources their states deploy. I won't pick on New Jersey, but my own state of Massachusetts is building, I believe it's 1.3 megawatts of offshore wind, or 1.6 megawatts of offshore wind, and 1.3 megawatts of Canadian hydro by law. And other states, including Illinois, New York, and perhaps New Jersey, if the governor signs a law, are directing their distribution companies to pay money to the nuclear units to make sure they stay on. I think there are both climate and economic development considerations, and that's causing a tension in the regional markets that are using market structures to set a price and decide what gets built, because if you have some resources that are chosen by the state and others that are relying on the market to decide whether they get chosen, you have an obvious tension. And we're smack in the middle of that right now. My strong view is that the ideal approach would be to use market structures to achieve the attributes that states want. So if states want to achieve climate enhancement, then price that into the market through a carbon price. That's much easier to say than it is to accomplish. California has carbon pricing. New York is considering it. Much harder in the multi-state regions such as the 13-state PJM or even the 6-state New England. But still not off the table in my book. The second best approach is for the markets and the stakeholders in the markets to come up with market design solutions to accommodate state rules while still letting the market run. Not, again, easier to say than to do, but we did a couple weeks ago approve a proposal from the New England market that recognized that Massachusetts and other states are buying a lot of new resources and came up with an auction mechanism to sort of feather them into the market. It was approved by a majority of the FERC with 3 separate opinions, so was not an easy decision, but it's an example of a regional solution. And PJM has now filed not 1, but 2 proposals that will be before FERC, and this saga will continue. I think I would be perfectly happy if any state, New Jersey or any other, said, we're done with the markets choosing our resources, we're gonna go back to the old way and do integrated resource management and choose the resources. I mean, I wouldn't be perfectly happy, I'd be disappointed, but it works. As long as you have a clear structure, someone has the responsibility, then you run an energy market, as happens in some parts of the country. But as long as we're still using the markets, FERC is still in, and we have to sort of struggle through this. Every year there's an issue. This is our issue. 5 years from now, this won't be the issue, but it's the issue now. So the second thing, now that I've said the markets are insoluble, is pipeline infrastructure. We have a program at FERC where we bring back former chairmen to speak about what it was like at FERC in their time. And we had Joe Kelleher, who was the chairman in the George W. Bush administration. In fact, toward the end of the George W. Bush administration, and one of the employees asked him, what was pipeline work when you were chairman? And he said, it was very uneventful. The stuff came up from staff, we mostly voted it out, and there wasn't a lot of fuss and bother about it. I mean, we did the cases carefully, but it wasn't very controversial. That has changed. In my 7 years at FERC, there's been a tremendous growth in the demand, the applications for pipeline projects. So gas used to come, I know this is also simple, but it used to come from Texas and the Gulf and Louisiana. And when the Natural Gas Act was passed in 1938, the purpose was we can't let Texas and Louisiana have all the gas. You have to share it with the other people. Make it easy for other people to get that precious, rare commodity natural gas so they won't have to manufacture gas in the city center like we used to. And that's what the Natural Gas Act was all about. Well, that's not where gas comes from anymore. With the new extraction technologies, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Arkansas, Oklahoma, big North Dakota, big swaths of the country are producing enormous quantities of natural gas. And so we are seeing tremendous demand for gas pipelines to get the gas to the generating locations, to get the gas to export, which is approved by the Department of Energy, and just generally to get the gas to market. Much greater opposition than we ever saw before. First, because there are so many of them. Second, because of concerns about fracking, which is regulated at the state level, being deflected into our dockets. Third, because a lot of the pipelines are going places that are not normal pipeline places. You know, it's not southern Louisiana, which is Pipeline City. And fourth, because of long-term climate issues. People saying, these pipes are gonna last 60 years. What if we don't use gas anymore in 30 years? What, are we building a lot of stranded infrastructure? How are you figuring this out? And natural gas has a very, very complicated relationship with climate change. Like that movie, It's Complicated. I mean, first gas was the savior. I mean, in the whole period of the 90s and the first half of whatever you call the 2000s, Conservation Law Foundation, NRDC were saying, burn gas, don't burn coal. Gas is better. Everyone should go on gas. Gas was the savior because it was so much cleaner and less carbon than other forms of fossil fuel. Then, once coal was kind of not being built anymore, people said, you know what, gas is actually a fossil itself. Did you realize that? I actually had a person come to my office and tell me, Commissioner LaFleur, did you know that gas leaks methane? I said, well, no, natural gas is methane. They're like, no. Methane is a pollutant that comes from the natural part of gas. It's like, whatever you say. But now gas is no longer the environmental savior. Now that people are looking to a far more heavy renewable future, gas has become much more of the environmental villain. So we face three basic sets of issues at FERC, simple little issues. The first is, how do we decide you need a pipeline? Back in the day, in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, FERC would get out maps and get studies and decide the pipeline should go from here to here to here, you don't need one. Kind of like the way we used to do certificate of need in the hospitals. You don't need an x-ray machine, there's one down the street. That's the way FERC did it. And people said, I'm sick of all this bureaucracy, let the market decide. The market's way better than planning, a bunch of regulators in Washington. So we said, if you have enough people sign up for the pipeline, it's fully subscribed, they're paying for it, no one else has to pay, then you just do your environmental review and it's assumed to be needed. And FERC has had that system since 1999, basically. Now that there's gas everywhere, and we're starting to say, is just having people sign up enough to get a pipeline? Shouldn't we look at what they're signing up for? Are they a distribution company that needs it to heat houses? Are they using it for power plants? Are they just a marketer building it on spec? Is it being exported? How do we think about that when we don't, it's the Secretary Perry that approves the export? We have a whole set of different ways that people support gas, but we still have been looking at the contracts, and that's been a tension point. The second is, since the late 70s, probably something Jeannie wrote, no, that we were probably in school then, or in grade school, but the National Environmental Policy Act makes you look at every aspect of the environmental impact of building a pipeline or anything else the federal government approves. Our NEPA documents back in like 1978 were like 5 pages long. Now they're like 2 CDs each. And that's just, you know, the species and the water and the rivers and all. And increasingly, people are coming in and saying, what about climate? Are you looking at the downstream greenhouse gas impacts of the gas you're going to transport? How can you say that's not part of the pipeline? But if you don't even know where it's going, other than that somebody signed up for it, that gets to be very difficult. And this has been a major issue with multiple strong feelings on all sides and multiple dissents and debates at the commission. I have come to the strong belief that we have to look more than we did before. We had a DC Circuit case that said that. It's not easy to do so, however, because how do you factor in something global with something local? It's easier, again, easier to say, but I believe we have to start figuring it out. And then the third issue is, as the things have become more controversial and take forever and long multi-100-page orders and 1,000-page environmental documents, the people who want pipelines and President Trump and others are saying, what is the problem, FERC? Why can't you do this in a year? Get on with life, be more efficient. Can't you streamline this? So we're looking at that too. It seems a little oxymoronic with looking at doing more, also looking at doing it faster, but we are. So yesterday it was announced that next week on the FERC agenda, we will be looking at something that's been announced, which is reopening the certificate policy statement and taking a look at how we review and approve pipelines. Can't say more about it till next week, but if any energy lawyers were bored, maybe not getting enough work fighting Secretary Perry's things, here's a new thing to work on, the FERC docket of 2019. And all kidding aside, I think it's extremely important. So I think that's enough to baffle you with, since I have only questions and no answers. I just wanted to say a couple sort of closer to home things. We have a lot going on in the national energy, indeed international and environmental policy. I have reluctantly come to the conclusion that the baby boom, despite our brilliance, is not going to thoroughly solve and resolve every issue that the nation faces. So I am actively on a campaign to get the best and the brightest from the Princeton Energy Association and other universities and companies and so forth to be part of this problem. I fell into energy. Many, many people my age did. But now we're seeing people like Chris, who got his degree at Duke in this, and others choose this as a profession. And I strongly urge people to consider it. These issues are not going away, and I think it's going to be a very interesting way. And they can't be outsourced. You know, so far we haven't figured out how to get all your energy from overseas. You have to do it here. There's jobs right here in our community. And every year, since I've been at FERC, I've had Princeton interns through the PICS program. I think I have a couple of them here today. Reva Abral was my intern last summer. Wesley Brown is going to be my intern this summer. My first intern from 2011 is a full-time federal employee now. She came back. What could be better? So all kidding aside, before all of this New Jersey stuff happened, this was why I wanted to come and talk to the Energy Association. We need you on these problems. With that, I'll take your questions. Thank you. All right. Sorry, I'm behind the podium. I have a broken wing, so I'm trying to lean. Yes.
Hi, Cheryl. I'm Lyle Wallings from the...
I know you hang out with Ed Seliga.
all day long.
Yeah.
But I'm also head up the Mid-Atlantic Solar Energy Industries Association, soon to be renamed the Mid-Atlantic Solar and Storage Association. And for the last few years, PJM has been killing off nearly all solar plus storage projects in New Jersey from a string of interpretations of regulations, and they're blaming FERC by and large. And we did a deep dive, Ed and I, into solar plus storage starting about 3.5 years ago, and have seen all of our projects killed. So is FERC on a roll to try to get new policies and interpretations of policies to encourage storage projects in the region?
Well, first of all, I forgot this in my speech, so I'll say it now while I buy time for your question. I go all around the country and talk about how New Jersey is a leader in solar. And I always say, you know, I went to Princeton, so I know it's not sunny there. But it really shows that policy drives outcomes, and that's what drove the solar work here. And I think that's true at the market level as well. FERC is not on a roll to hurt solar. Well, we're certainly not on a roll to hurt solar, but I was going to say to hurt storage. In fact, in February, we voted out a rule requiring that the regional markets allow storage to participate in any service that it's technologically capable of providing. I'm trying to think through what aspect of our work it is that PJM is saying is killing. I know we have had, if it's in the capacity market, we've had a lot of debates about seasonal capacity and whether something has to be on all year round. Otherwise, I'll have to take it offline and sort of figure out. I don't know, Craig. You're looking for Craig. He ran away. He thought we were going to get bad questions. No. Yes.
Hi, Commissioner. Thank you for coming to talk to us today. Also, thanks to Amber for making this possible. My name is Jack. I'm an undergrad student here, and I was just wondering if FERC, since the 1999 rule rewriting, has ever not approved of a natural gas expansion project for environmental reasons.
We have definitely not. The two that I can think of that we recently said no to were both for a balance of need and environment. We said there's not need to justify the environmental impacts. We've had others where we've had split decisions and some of us would have said no. We've also had a lot of hydro we said no to for environmental reasons. But I think your question implies, which is the case, that we have approved the vast majority of pipelines that get all the way through us. I mean, some get killed off in the pre-filing if they're really stupid places. And that's the kind of historical circumstance that's driving us to think, are we doing it right? Maybe that was okay when we got 3 a decade, but now are we needing to make more discriminating judgments because we have approved the vast majority of them? We have said no to some, but not that many.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. My name is Amanda, and I'm also an undergrad here. And just to follow up on that, could you speak to any conditions under which FERC requires a health impact assessment in addition to an environmental impact assessment, and whether you think this will become more frequent, as you're saying you're looking at the process and looking to become more discriminating with the larger number of plants that are filing to be built? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we do health impacts as part of the environmental review. Frequently, like asthma, we look at asthma pockets near compressor stations and other health-related issues. We have not done, which I'm guessing you're talking about, but I don't know, health related to extraction, which is another whole issue, fracking related. We've only done macro statistics of like how much water does fracking impact, how much acreage of land does it impact, but we have done the health, I think fairly carefully, the health implications of the direct facilities. If there are things you think we should do more, I'd love to talk after, and I think that could come through in this docket. I mean, more of the issues recently have been about either climate or extraction-related impacts, but if there are other environmental impacts we're missing, we should know about them.
Well, thanks so much for being here. Could you give us some sense, the FERC seems to be kind of an island of sanity in DC. You actually seem to be able to make reasoned decisions and come to reasonable conclusions. What is it about the institution or about the players or the issues that you attribute that to?
Well, thank you for that. I think that the independent agency model has served us well, not just in real time, but in kind of building our culture. Chris was talking with a couple of the interns when we had coffee earlier about people come to FERC and they think they're just going to stay for a little while, but there's a real dedication to mission on the part of a lot of the employees, and you really feel you're not in a political body. This is my only government job, but I can certainly look out and see some of the other agencies that have been roiled by politics in the last year and a half. And I think the independent model, and until recently we were kind of seen as like these technocrats that were put in. I think we also have managed to attract excellent staff, and we've had a great mix of people who stayed a long time and people who, knew people all the time, which I think has been very healthy. I think we were rated the #1 place to work in federal government for our size in the Partnership for Public Service survey. I think partly because I hope we have good work-family benefits and all. So I think cultures are very strong in organizations. Good cultures are strong, bad cultures are strong. I'm pleased with the commissioners we got appointed by President Trump. I'm not going to lie that I was nervous on election night, like, who are we going to get? Oh, my God. But I think they gave us good people, and I'm just hopeful that, Washington ebbs and flows, that we weather this period of a lot of political pressures, with things like the Secretary Perry thing. But I think bad cultures are hard to change and good cultures are hard to ruin, so hopefully we can not screw it up for a while longer. Yeah.
So our group at the Andlinger Center is thinking hard about deep decarbonization of the power grid by mid-century, wondering how that might happen and how to do that in a way that minimizes costs to society and cumulative greenhouse gas emissions and, in general, disruption to the industry. And so we're looking at both technologies and policies, advanced technologies, and all the interesting policies that are coming up. And the policy side I find kind of frightening. It's so complicated. There are so many stakeholders. And I'm just wondering if you know, as academicians, we get to think about things as they might be rather than as they are. And I wonder if you have any visions of a system that is more rational and less torn by you know, different desires, or if that's just fundamentally the way it is because there's so many different stakeholders.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think that I agree with you that the policy and the kind of fragmented governmental decision-making are the bigger problems. The technology will get there. For example, the things I've read, you probably know a lot more about it than I do, but on deep decarbonization, in order to really use it, well, letting storage developing would be a major support. I mean, developing to a level of being able to be for more hours than we have storage now in most places. That wasn't very well said. But I think in order to really get mostly off natural gas other than an emergency fuel, there's only a few different ways I can see that you could do it and under current technology. And one would be to have major transmission, this is in the National Renewable Energy Lab, did a big study on this a couple years ago, a much more interconnected transmission grid, so you could use the wind in the middle part of the country and the solar in the west and across time zones and all would really help. And if we're gonna like use electrification for vehicles and all as part of carbon, you'd really need to deploy some of those big resources. And so one big problem we have is unlike pipelines, which with all their problems, they do have a clear structure, transmission is done state by state, and any kind of interstate transmission, like these DC line, direct current lines that Clean Line was trying to get from the Midwest wind to population centers, it's easy to hit a state that doesn't want it going across. And so if we had a national carbon goal of really deep decarbonization, I think you'd have to have some more federal siting, the same way we got the railroads, the highways, and other systems to really put the transmission corridors in place. And I don't see a path without some legislative change. The other thing you could do is really a very heavy reliance on nuclear, but the winds are blowing so much in the other direction with the Toshiba bankruptcy and so forth. When I first went to FERC, I made speeches about the nuclear renaissance, and it seems more like just a momentary weekend off in the dark ages because there's no renaissance happening anymore. But that is a way you could have deep decarbonization. But I think if you're going to have a national strategy, more national control will probably be needed over some of the siting because it's a little too fragmented now. But I think there's a deeper issue right now, which is that it's not just federal state. That makes it sound like we're all just a bunch of monoliths. The country is deeply divided. I mean, before we have deep decarbonization, we have to have decarbonization. And before we have decarbonization, you have to agree carbon's a problem. And a majority, but not all the people think it is, and the people who don't think it is really, really don't think it is. So we have a very weird political ecosystem, and as I said, I mean, I look up at Canada. I mean, I just hate how we're always, the Canadians have a good medical system, but the Canadians do have a carbon goal. Even though they're pumping out natural gas and oil in the West, they still are managed to kind of have a goal. I don't think it's beyond human imagining that we could get there.
Question about transmission and stranded cost. Obviously, because of cyber tourism, because of climate change and things like Sandy, and those type of threats, people are going to distribute energy. Technology is getting more cost effective. So if alternatives to transmission make some sense, because a transmission line, people be paying forever, or there'll be stranded costs that somebody's gotta pick up. What are FERC's policies on DER and alternatives to transmission, as looking at that as an alternative before transmission is decided?
Well, the technical policy is if you're doing regional transmission planning, you're supposed to look at non-transmission alternatives like energy efficiency and other things first. But candidly, I don't worry, among all the things that keep me up at night, I don't worry we're going to have too much high voltage transmission because it's so hard to permit and build, and I don't worry we're going to have too much distributed resources because we had a 2-day tech conference and all we heard was state regulators, not all we heard, coming in and talking about how hard it is and how far in the future it is and how complicated the systems are and all, which a little bit, I think it's an insult to some people's business model. So I think that I think the likelihood of way too much transmission is low, lower than way too much pipelines, which I could see if we really get off gas, depending on our long-term export strategy. I also think that I'll just take a second to plug the Princeton microgrid. I think there's a sense that people have that somehow microgrids are like little islands that don't have to be connected to anything. But we're like a mile from the most effective microgrid in the country, right here in this auditorium. And the way it survives is by bidding everything into the PJM market. Yes, it islanded during Sandy, but the whole rest of the time it's part of the market, and you need a transmission for that. So I think they can work together. I think we'll have a big grid in my lifetime. Yes. Hey.
Yes, hi. It's great to see you, by the way. So my question is the following. So this morning, there was some talk about offshore wind with New Jersey. So how does FERC involve itself with offshore wind? And you keep mentioning transmission. So how are you guys looking at transmission with offshore wind and offshore wind as a whole in your office?
We're involved in two ways. We don't do the permitting. That's BOEM, what does that stand for? The Bureau of Oceanographic, Bureau of Energy Management. But we're not the ones who say you have this much of the shelf and you have this much of the shelf. I think we get involved in 3 ways or 2 ways, really. One is the kind of pricing of the energy which goes into the markets. And first you have to build it and all before you have that issue. But that gets to the issues. As I said, in New England, they're building a lot of they say they're building a lot of offshore wind, and they now have a market structure to bid it in. And the second is the transmission. And when I was first at FERC, there was a talk, I don't think it's been happening anymore, but Atlantic Grid was supposed to go up and down the coast with like lines into, and we approved it and gave it transmission rates and a big ROE incentive for being so innovative, and it never got built. So I would imagine something like that, not prejudging what we would give it, but something like that could recur. If you were building it, you'd have to come into FERC for transmission rates. Having watched very closely when they tried to build Cape Wind outside in the Massachusetts coast, I think, as with many things, the siting and the local opposition was the biggest issue. If the state gets behind it and they put it far enough out to sea, we know the technology works. It's in the North Sea. I mean, God, if the English and the Irish can do it, we can do it. I mean, it's just turbines, you know. Oh God.
Other than your annoying husband, what is the thing that most keeps you up at night?
Oh. I would say the 2 things that keep, besides you, that keep me up at night are the slowness and the problems of really getting behind the climate challenge. Because if you believe what the climatologists say, and I tend to. You know, years are passing while we kind of fight. And, you know, now it's 2020 till the next election. We don't know what's going to happen then. We don't know who's going to have the Hill. But, you know, years are passing. That's number one. And number two, which we haven't talked at all about, is grid security issues, cyber attacks, geomagnetic disturbances, which I think we're sort of getting our arms around with some of the new rules we put in place, even EMP attacks. This is like a bomb in the upper atmosphere that could disable the communications devices that control the grid and everything else. Security issues. We just seem to live in an increasingly insecure world with all the global tensions. And, you know, I'm only, quote, in charge of, unquote, the grid, not the whole society, but I do like to think that it's secure, and a lot of money has gone into making it more secure, but it still keeps me up.
We can keep on asking you questions. So back to the pipeline with stranded costs. I had suggested to former Commissioner Honorable, when she was still there the day before the Princeton pipeline went in, that it might make sense for FERC to sit down with the 22 pipelines being proposed at that time in New Jersey and try to work out where the need is, what the routes are environmentally with the environmental agencies, and lessen the amount of competition and actually work out siting them in a need and environmental basis. The economist of FERC, I won't tell you which one's response was, that we let the market play out. And also suggested that the people in the Christie administration, that was the same response. Can you think of another way other than letting the market play it out and have all those people waste all that time and money and try to get them sited?
Well, this gets to how we determine need. And one of the things that I hope we'll see teed up for comment in the pipeline certificate process that's starting next week is, should we be looking at things regionally? Something I call for in the Atlantic Coast MVP, because they kind of go near each other across the Adirondacks, as well as, I mean, there was a time when we had the 3 LNG import terminals near each other in Oregon. There was a time when FERC did comparative analysis. There was called the Aspacher Doctrine, based on some Federal Communications Commission case that related to who got radio wavelength or something. And we would like look and say, okay, you want to go from here to here, and you want to go 100 miles up from here to here. We're going to look at you together. As part of going to like the market and the agreements we got away from that, that is a way this could, you know, the need thing could play out. I'm playing the long game because I don't know what's going to happen right now with this FERC, but we need to be talking about it. I mean, and I wouldn't say that there's been like a terrible problem of too many pipelines right next to each other, but the process now would allow it as long as they're not, if they're right at the same time, then we'd have to do the NEPA together. But if they're not at the same time or economically dependent, like if one goes to the other one, then we have to do the NEPA together. But if one's 1 year and one's 2 years later, we don't have to do the NEPA together unless we somehow change the process. I know it's getting kind of geeky when we're using acronyms like NEPA.
Does FERC have mandate to only review the new projects, or do you have the mandate to review old pipelines which are corroding, leaking?
This is another way in which government is very complicated. We only review the construction of pipelines. Once they're built, the Pipeline Health and Safety Administration, whatever that stands for, PHMSA, which is part of the Department of Transportation, takes over responsibility for the safety and operation of the pipeline, although we retain it for LNG terminals. We have that and hydro, we do safety inspections, but the pipeline goes to the Department of Transportation. And as if that wasn't complicated enough, the cybersecurity of existing pipelines is done by the Department of Homeland Security, whereas the cybersecurity of the electric grid is done by FERC. So you would think, you know, if this was a corporate reorg and you were doing an org chart, you might put those together. But, so no, we only do the new, and then the Department of Transportation, and to an extent, the Department of Homeland Security do it. Although when we look at a new pipeline and we do an alternatives analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act, we at times look at, could this other one take the gas? You know, that we don't have to pretend the existing ones don't exist, but we don't regulate them day to day for safety.
If I may ask, what is our long-term natural gas export strategy?
I would say right now, it appears that the strategy is to export as much as possible because it helps the economy. That I don't see, I've heard nothing from the DOE that there's any kind of limit. And the geologists haven't been giving any indications that we're running out anytime soon. Quite the opposite, they just keep going deeper and finding more. In the Obama administration, they had done some baseline studies of like how much could you export before it started to impact domestic price. And there was a sense, although never, Judy may know more, it was never like concretized that there was some, they were going to approve up to some limit and then take a pause and see where we were. I'm not sure that that kind of volumetric limiter exists right now. Yeah, it was not formally done, but they put out some kind of study of like, you can do this much without having any impact. There was a lot of debate about if you exported too much, then it would hurt domestic economies that were very reliant on gas as a feedstock. Again, because of the supply, the great supply, so far they haven't been at war recently. Whether our trade battles will make people not want to buy from us is above my pay grade, but it does make me wonder. I'm not an expert, well, assuming I'm an expert on anything, it's not that.
Could you elaborate on, I loved your advice about advising the students here to go into energy and environment. These are such important issues. Do you have any specific advice for students, say for seniors, about who they should talk to, where they should go, some particular things that they might want to?
Well, I know you had a career fair, and I wish we brought our FERC brochures, because we do at times have entry-level jobs, but I think a few well-worn paths are for, depending on how many loans you have to pay and how economically driven you are. A couple of my interns have gone into the consulting sector within energy. And so the intern who just started at FERC was at Booz Allen, actually doing a big project for the Department of the Navy, doing solar, and they're trying to do a gigawatt of solar in the Obama administration. But she did that and then came to the government. Depending on your salary needs, and one of my others is at the Brattle Group, so that's that strategy, because those people those consulting firms always want people from places like Princeton, and there's some that are very energy and environment focused, and they don't all do evil things. They work for all ends of the spectrum depending on who they are. I think we've also seen a pattern of some people starting in state government, which tends to not pay very well. Not that FERC is like the path to fame and fortune, but it pays a little better than state government. But if you can afford to do it, sometimes those are good first jobs to get, and then if you like it, you can decide, go to FERC, go to a company. I don't know, Ralph would know more. I don't think that many companies hire too many entry-level, other than, obviously they hire linemen and computer people. IT people can go anywhere, but I don't know how many right out of Princeton you hire.
So we've actually tried very hard to recruit from Princeton. And what we're finding, quite candidly, because I think sugarcoating it doesn't help anyone, is that in the most selective engineering schools, and clearly Princeton is one, we lose out to financial services, tech, and consulting. And I'm on boards at Columbia, at MIT, I'm on the Amling board here. So I've actually personally tried to recruit. Where we seem to be successful is your Woodrow Wilson graduates. So energy does appear to attract policy wonks. From the point of view of engineering, I've actually had to manage mutinies at my company because when we are on those rare occasions successful bringing in a selected school engineer, we work hard to train them, because you really don't trust a newly minted engineer doing serious work. We work hard to train them for about a year and then we lose them to Goldman Sachs. And my people flat out tell me, no offense, they'd much rather hire somebody from NJIT or Stevens or Penn State, because thermodynamics and Kirchhoff laws and calculus are the same wherever you go, and those kids want to stay. I know that's maybe not on maybe something the market, but that's what we run into.
We had a similar experience when I was in the private sector in New England. Back in the day, we got a lot of our engineers from the MIT electrical engineering program. That's now 80%. The kids will stay local. But the other one I didn't mention is non-governmental organizations. I recently met with, I don't remember, it wasn't the Coalition for Sustainable FERC, but some other sustainability organization, and it was all kids within 5 years of law school or really dynamic, energized young people. So, and there are, some of them don't pay as well, but there's some very good jobs at places like EDF and Sierra Club and so forth. And FERC. Don't forget that. I should have put that first and foremost.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. It was awesome to hear from you. I'm going to start a few thank yous. I want to first of all thank the New Jersey State Legislature for their exquisite timing. We really appreciate them taking into account our conference date when they decided when to vote on the legislation, so that we had something new and exciting to talk about today. As I think you've heard several times today, this really is a pivotal moment in electricity policy broadly at the national level, and particularly in New Jersey with this major state legislation that has just gone through the legislature, and the governor is thinking about it, and this is unfolding in real time. We also have market reforms that are going to be before the FERC, and there's a lot that will matter to this region for our PJM regional market. And we were really lucky today because this conference featured a lot of these key players, and they consented to spend their time with us, and we really, really appreciate that. We're also grateful to the Anlander Center for this lovely venue and for their commitment to bringing together the university community and policymakers and stakeholders to talk about these really important issues of energy and environmental policy. And I want to thank all of you for coming and to participate in this conversation. It's a really important conversation to have. We hope that you got a sense, our sort of sub-theme for the day was how our electricity system depends on the interplay of technology and innovation, state and federal policy, power markets, and human behavior. We heard about all these different aspects today and really appreciate that. And we really hope that this conference begins something new here at Princeton, an annual event for discussing and analyzing energy issues and solutions. We welcome your feedback as to how we can make next year's meeting even better, and we really hope this is going to be an annual tradition. And finally, and most importantly, we're really grateful for the efforts of the student-run Princeton University Energy Association, without which this would not have happened. They've worked really tirelessly including until quite late last night. We really, really appreciate their efforts. We're now going to end the plenary portion of the conference, and we're going to segue to our workshops, our tours, and our career fair. So I'd like to call up Amber back up to the podium, Amber Lynn, our president of the PUEA, to tell you about the rest of the afternoon.